So the Cook County Land Bank. If you've driven much around the county, and in particular the south and west side of the city, you've noticed that there's a lot of abandoned properties. So the Cook County Land Bank is an agency that's designed to take some of those properties and put them back to work. And the way that they're planning on doing this, and I say planning because they are only just now starting to staff up. They don't have a managing director yet. It's a new organization. But what they will have the ability to do is acquire properties, hold them tax-free, do things like clear title for give-back taxes, and identify responsible developers or property managers or citizens within the community to take them over. Right? So you can imagine the land bank going into a distressed neighborhood and finding a house that's really in bad shape, is presenting maybe a safety hazard to some of the people who live there, tearing it down and handing it to the neighbor as a side yard. Or you could imagine going into a neighborhood where there's a lot of demand for rentals, but there's a lot of vacancy due to the foreclosure crisis, and then rehabbing a building and turning it over to a property management company or to a nonprofit that's acting in the area to serve as affordable housing. So this is their goal. However, if you take a look at the map that Derek put together of the 311 complaints here in Chicago about vacant abandoned buildings, you'll notice that there are a lot of them, and that the amount of money that the Cook County Land Bank has to deal with them is nowhere near enough, right, to handle all of them. So you have to pick the ones where you're going to have the highest impact. And so the project that we were doing with the Cook County Land Bank this summer was giving them a tool to evaluate which neighborhoods were at risk of destabilization. In other words, neighborhoods where the price may be declining dramatically or where vacancy may be increasing dramatically. And within those neighborhoods, which were the highest impact properties? So which are the ones that are on blocks that may be relative bastions of stability inside neighborhoods with instability, or even vice versa? Blocks that may be a good starting point for building out, or blocks that may be at risk of sort of spreading this vacancy throughout the area. So the way that we did this is we worked with the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul, who provided us a lot of information about the real estate market in Cook County, transactions, mortgages, foreclosures. And we came up with some indicators for them and looked at the way that those indicators have performed over the past decade or so in relation to stability indicators like crime and so on, to see whether there might be leading indicators out there that people can use as sort of an early warning system for a neighborhood that's at risk. And so we developed a web-based tool that unfortunately also I can't show you, that lets you surf around the county, take a look at different municipalities, take a look at different census tracts, see how they relate to the rest of the surrounding community in terms of income, stability, and so on. And we did some analysis of the pricing impacts of the various treatments that the land bank can apply to properties. Any questions on this?
It only shows Chicago.
This is only showing Chicago because we only have 311 complaints for Chicago. Right. So we have a lot of the real estate market indicators that we got from IHS spread throughout the county. We have crime, census, demographic information throughout the county. But the city has done a lot more data releases, so crime and 311 complaints.
So what does each dot represent?
Well, I stole this plot from Derek, actually. I think each dot is a 311 complaint. That's right.
Each dot is someone calling in about a vacant abandoned property.
Right.
So these are the boarded up properties and empty lots throughout the city that we know about. There's a lot of
that people complain about.
People complain about.
So interesting fact, it's really, really, really hard from just looking at data and not being on the ground to tell which properties are vacant. The U.S. Postal Service collects some data about vacancy because they don't want to be delivering mail to property where nobody lives. Right? 311 gives you some information because some neighborhoods, in particular, complain about vacant properties, and when police officers and others show up at vacant properties, they report them. And there's also organizations like the community organization, the Southwest Organizing Project, that operates down here. They've actually gone on the ground and driven around looking for buildings that are boarded up or being occupied or whatever. And so the Institute for Housing Studies took these three lists, 311, Postal Service, and Actual Ground Truth, compared them, and saw such little overlap that it almost made them think that the first two were useless. Because these things change on a short time scale, right? If there's been a foreclosure filed, a lot of times the people will just move out right after they get the notice in the mail. and then the property will just sit there for 2 years while it slowly winds its way through the court system. And any point in that process, somebody can come in and break the windows and start stealing things out of it, or it could, there could be a small fire, or any number of terrible things can happen to this property while it's just sitting there unwatched by anybody. And the data just isn't keeping up with that fast enough.
So I work for a nonprofit that's actually using the information that you got. And so the young people that I work with, they're making recommendations to Tony Preckwinkle about using the land bank in conjunction with juvenile justice issues. So what I was wondering, I thought the dots meant a lot more than what you just said, but is there a way to show, it seems like if those are the reports for vacant buildings, is there some way to find out if those areas have like high, I'm sure they have high crime rates, but like incarceration rates?
So it's surprising. There's areas where there is relatively high crime, but there's actually not that much vacancy, and vice versa. But yeah, for sure, there's a lot of correspondence.
Is there a way to get that?
Yes.
Okay.
It's actually using the data on the portal alone. You can do a lot of analysis.
The 311 portal?
So you can get the 311 calls on vacant and abandoned buildings, and you can also get the crime reports. And you can just
do that
to
City of Chicago.
And I'd be happy to help you out with that too.
This is just a random question. I've never owned a house. I don't know how this works, but should there be like tax data on like which property is paying property taxes?
So there is. There's an interesting fact about Cook County. If you don't pay your taxes for a year, one thing that the county could do is they could send the sheriffs to your door and demand that you pay your taxes. Another thing that they could do is they could outsource this, right? They could take your tax debt and sell it at an auction and put somebody else in charge of getting the money from you. And that's what they actually do. So, and it turns out that once that debt is sold and somebody starts pounding on your door to try to make you pay, you almost always pay, right? So we know which tax debts get sold, but we don't know which ones get paid off because a private company is in charge of, or private individuals who buy it at the tax auction are in charge of that.
So we don't know.
And like 95% of them get paid off.
Yeah. So it's kind of like legalized loan sharking, which is pretty awesome. Not. But because it's done by private companies, we just don't know what the outcomes are. We know they got sold to somebody. We don't know if those people like crack schools to get the stuff.
Privatization is bad.
So is there any way to pressure, like, as part of the deal, buying this debt, like, that you have to report back? Is there some, is there anybody trying to push on that?
There are political players within Cook County who are seeking to reform this in various ways, yes.
Wow, you got really good.
Wow, man, you are, right?
Yeah.
It's old data, so I don't think it would be super helpful, but I think there's variables in the PHDCN data set on boarded up houses and vacant lots.
Oh, really? Now, what is the PHDCN data?
Nick, you would know.
The project on human development in Chicago neighborhoods. The last.
Oh, this is the
2003.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
I know about this data
96
set.
data, but like they have grad students hand coding
Yeah.
video footage of Chicago streets.
And they did some beautiful experiments too, right? Where they were dropping dollar bills and seeing whether they got returned and stuff like
And
this.
then
Letters.
cool stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, there were.
That was letters, that's right.
Yeah.
Anyway, great stuff. I wish they were still doing it. This would be nice to have more current data.
And you said you were making indicators to look at, or you were trying to create indicators of measures of stability. And then you were talking about trying to advise the land bank on how to make policy. Do you have any sort of guiding theory about how many pieces of property need to be dealt with by the land bank in order to there to be some sort of threshold of impact?
Well, we know from some interventions that have been done in response to the foreclosure crisis that if you spread yourself too thin and you're only doing a handful of homes in a neighborhood, that the effect is well, we can't say for sure that the effect isn't huge, but our intuitive sense for it is that it's not huge. You're better off picking a few areas that you can really make a difference in, and doing so in a way that is partnering with agencies that have a lot of presence on the ground. Right? And so The answer to your question is, well, at least for the first year while they're gearing up, we're talking about 1,000 homes, and they're not going to be randomly distributed. Right? They're hoping to be very systematic about this, and they're hoping to pick out a few areas in which to give this a try, to do so systematically, and then to evaluate the impact and change their strategy as they go forward.
Because what usually happens is people just spray money all over the map, and odds are it doesn't do very much because you're not kind of really focusing on something. But really, we don't know because these things are rarely followed up on. The cool thing is because we've assembled all this data on neighborhoods and even parcels, we could try to see what the very local impact is of, say, focusing on this set of blocks in that neighborhood. That's cool because it means that they could eventually get to something that works, hopefully.
I've heard an idea that from Chicago Streetcar Renaissance that the land bank buy up the vacant properties that are along a strip that they know they're going to invest in some other way, like incorporating or adding a streetcar line or updating the CTA lines, something that they know that attracts developers to invest in that neighborhood or along that strip, and that it's like kind of city insider trading where they buy the properties up along the area that they know are going to do other things to increase property values on.
So the tricky bit for me about this land bank project is that there are things that the land bank can do to make itself extremely profitable, right? But it's not really in the public interest to have a property speculator funded by tax dollars running around out there, right? So, and the people who've set up the land bank understand this. So their goal is not so much to try to go into a neighborhood and start gentrifying it up. Their goal is to take a neighborhood that is, you know, let's say primarily working class, let's say, and is at risk of you know, losing population.
Because it was doing pretty good, and then the foreclosure crisis hit, and like a bunch of places went belly up, and so it's kind of in this limbo of like, okay, are people gonna start buying houses here again, or is it gonna start emptying out, which you really don't want?
So I can't speak for the board, but I'd be a little bit uncomfortable with them playing games like that.
You said earlier that part of the problem is like they're in foreclosure, they're in limbo, the titles are dirty, or they keep changing hands. So one of the things is the Cook County Land Bank is trying to take the title back and just and present it, saying to the new homeowner, like, you don't have to deal with that bullshit. We've already done it for you.
Yeah, the foreclosure process is terrible. It's so terrible. And one of the worst things about it is that most people don't know their rights. They don't know that if they get a notice of foreclosure in the mail, that doesn't mean they have to move out the next day. And the fact that they do, almost always do that, means that there's a lot more abandoned buildings in the city than there has to be, and that leads to a lot more disrepair and disamenities to their neighbors than there has to be.
Just for people who haven't been foreclosed on. I mean, I really don't think most people know what foreclosure really is. What it is like you get a loan, right? You get a mortgage when you buy a property, you pay it back. You can't pay it back for a while. They say, okay, well, we're going to start a court process to eventually probably get that property back from you because you're not paying your bills. That's what a foreclosure is, but it takes like 18 months or some craziness in Illinois because there's so many of them. And rather than people sitting there and kind of continue to live in the property, maintain the property, people tend to leave. And so that's how these kind of foreclosures are linked to, you know, buildings that are literally falling down and becoming, you know, problems where they lower surrounding property values, they can attract crime, and they're not giving property taxes because nobody's paying that. So that's why
you can sell your property at any time during foreclosure.
You can if there's a healthy real estate market, which there isn't right now in a lot of these neighborhoods.
No one would have bought it.
Depends. Yeah. Depends on how underwater you may or may not.
That's right. That's right. So and there's other options too, right? The mortgage could be, you know, written down by some amount so that it becomes practical for you to pay it again. They could do a short sale. They could. I mean, there's any number of things that they could do.
Sure.
What they're actually doing in a lot of cases is not much, or even just walking away. Unfortunately, and they're starting. I should say the lenders are starting to get better about this, but they were in a very unfortunate situation too, where they didn't have the capacity to deal with this flood of foreclosures. They hadn't had to worry about it when prices were going up.
So there's a bit of there's like a bit of news actually about the vacant building ordinance in Chicago. It happened yesterday.
Yeah.
That a federal judge ruled that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are exempt from the enforcement of this ordinance. So how do you think that will impact the work of the land bank going forward?
Well, I can't really say. I will tell you that I think what's likely to happen from my perspective is that the data piece of this, these community indicators and trying to get a sense for what leading indicators of decline are, will be useful at the beginning, but once the land bank decides on specific areas where they want to focus, they're going to get to know those areas. They're going to have people on the ground, organizations that they trust that they're working with there. And at that point, identifying vacant buildings in the data becomes less important because you can identify vacant buildings by looking at them. So my hope would be that it won't affect it that much, but I guess we'll see.
All right, we gotta keep going, or not.
Real quick, just a question about that first question. I thought was super interesting about how many homes you need to stabilize, and you mentioned a bunch of times you're going to pick neighborhoods, or the land bank is going to pick some neighborhoods for 1,000 houses. Was there a discussion of that end number of like how many neighborhoods? Because what if it turns out that if you buy 500 houses, it's not enough, and the neighborhood would still sink? Then you really just need to pick one neighborhood.
Yeah.
Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, and how would you guys help figure out?
I think that this is a real question, and nobody's tried picking up 1,000 houses in it. Well, the closest thing I think to a natural experiment in this respect, if you read the article in Chicago Magazine a couple months ago about Pocket Town. This is the guy who's the founder of Land's End, had a very emotional attachment to the neighborhood that he grew up in, which is on the south side of Chicago, near South Chicago in like 79th or something like that. It's right where Lee's Unleaded Blues Club is, and so he dumped an amazing amount of money into it, and a non-negligible percentage of the homes in that neighborhood have been redone through the grant money that he gave them, as well as schools and all sorts of other stuff as well. It did not magically turn around the real estate market, so it's quite possible that it will have to be very focused. Ultimately, that's a political decision, right? And they have to. It's a balancing act between trying to be maximally effective, but also trying to make sure that people aren't feeling like their concerns aren't being addressed. And I think that we will put them on the right path to starting that discussion, but we will not come to